There we go. I'm going to go ahead and record this in case anybody has signed up is not able to make it. I want to make sure that they can see this. If any of you is comfortable being filmed, please by all means turn off your camera. But otherwise, please stay on camera so we can, do this as a dialogue and a conversation. I wanted to go ahead and get us started. I'm Eddie Torres, President and CEO of Grantmakers in the Arts. I use he, him pronouns. I am coming to you from the unceded land of the Lenape-Munsee people. For those of you who can't see me, I'm a cisgendered man with light brown skin, dark hair and eyes, and a white beard. This discussion is part of a monthly series that'll continue through April 2022. I'm going to go ahead and put in the chat in a moment a hyperlink to the other discussions in this series. You can register for any of them that you want or for all of them. We would love to have you back. I'm also going to, in a moment, put into the chat a sign-in sheet so you can share your information with our friends at East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. So as you know, Grantmakers in the Arts is working to complement the report that we commissioned, Solidarity, Not Charity, Arts and Culture Grantmaking and Solidarity Economy, with discussions of real-world solidarity economy work to make tangible the points that Natalia Linares and Caroline Bullard made in this report. So we are doing this specifically so that we can complement our programming work with more hands-on, high-touch organizing work. We're really grateful that you are participating in this process with us, and we want to continue doing this kind of thing with you. With that said, the most important thing is that this is about artists and communities. It's not about Grantmakers in the Arts. So I'm not going to take up a bunch of your time. I'm going to hand it off to Caroline Bullard, and Carolyn is going to hand it off to our friends at East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. So Caroline.
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you for choosing to be present. You're in for an amazing experience and learning together over the next hour. I'd love to get a sense of who's here. If you could share your name and your pronouns and the land you're on, and anything about what brings you to this hour together, that'd be great. I'm just going to put that prompt in the chat. Your name, your pronouns, the land you're on, and what brings you to this hour together with evprex. So as that's flowing in, I'm going to share a little bit about Art.Coop in the next 5 minutes, and then we'll get to learn from the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative with Noni Session and Annie McShiris. So again, if you could share your name and your pronouns, the land you're on, and what brings you to this hour together, that'll help ground us together. We're doing this work together. So I'd love to know who's here. Who are you? Why do you love affordable space? What about arts and culture and economic justice excites you? Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Royal Allie Barnes. I'm the acting director of the Office of Arts and Culture in Seattle, Washington. We are on Indigenous lands. We are unwanted, but at this point, guests in that capacity of use. I use she and her pronouns. My passion is the arts, inclusivity, equity, and equanimity in the process, reallocating and realigning our resources so that we are actually building sustainable community, Indigenous, and ethnic wealth. That's my passion.
Yes, thank you for sharing that out loud. If anyone else wants to share out loud, that's great. If you want to put it in the chat, please do. And I'm going to share my screen, so we'll see who's here flowing in the chat. Here we go. All right, you should see a picture of Nati and Marina and me. Do you see that? Yeah, okay, cool. So again, we're here with Grantmakers in the Arts because they commissioned this report. My name is Caroline Woolard. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a white woman looking very pale. I'm in Berlin, Germany in the winter. It's dark at 4 p.m. here. And despite that, I am super energized to be here. I got to co-author the report that Eddie mentioned with Nati Linares, who's on the slide and also in my Zoom slide in my background. And now we organize Art.Coop with Marina Lopez, who you see also pictured here in the center. And I'll drop a link to the report in the chat after this short 5-minute presentation. So what is Art.Coop? We exist to grow the solidarity economy movement by centering systems change work led by artists and culture bearers. As Namaka Agbo says, it's about community ownership and democratic governance for political, cultural, and economic power. In other words, who owns and who decides? Often this is not community-centered, and that's what we hope to shift toward. The Sustainable Economies Law Center has a great prompt that I would ask you all to ask yourselves. How will you spread power and spread wealth and root it in hyper-local community? At Art.Coop, we spread power and wealth and root it in community when we connect cultural innovators across silos in the solidarity economy movement, when we amplify research, inspiration, resources, and events that lift up this work, when we move money to multi-year self-determined and systems change efforts led by artists, and when we study together in spaces like this hour to practice ways of spreading power and wealth and rooting it in community. Here's a page from our report. You'll see up at the top that the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative is seeding this cultural economy we want. So to learn more, you can read the full report. I'm going to give you some overviews now. You all from the Grantmakers and the arts community are poised to strengthen and grow the solidarity economy because, 1, Grantmakers excel at building and supporting infrastructure and institutions. 2, the main barrier for many of these solidarity economy entities is deliberate incubation and startup capital. 3, we all are learning about cooperative business structures right now and ways that co-ops already meet the charitable intent criteria, which we can get into. And 4, BIPOC artists and culture bearers are leading this work. So with the 4 major shifts that we heard about when Nati and I got to interview over 100 people, we heard about internal work and governance shifts, new tools and investment and endowment shifts, the need to take a systems change approach, and policy advocacy. And in particular, we heard again and again that grantmakers need to commit to long-term work with multi-year grants, loans, and equity investments for solidarity economy institutions and networks, like what we're about to hear today with evprex. Janelle Orsi asks, how can we not just put out the fires of the world, but build the solutions that can replace the destructive systems to create community wealth? evprex demonstrates a way forward with self-determination and permanently affordable space. Again, community ownership and community governance for political, cultural, and economic power. When grantmakers support community-controlled and permanently affordable infrastructure and space, you all will create long-term efficiencies in your giving practices, as grantees who benefit from this affordable space are no longer spending large portions of their organizational overhead on rent. As we'll learn from evprex, the impact is huge on artists and all working people. To give you a specific statistic, artists living in cultural districts pay over 60% of their income on rent. And a typical dancer or choreographer living in a community land trust only has to spend 6 hours a week, again, 6 hours a week, working to cover their housing costs, compared to 28 hours a week it would take to cover a market rate rental in the same area. So evprex, when they're centering their work in the Black arts community and making space affordable for generations to come, they're building what we need in order to focus on our work and culture in order to survive and thrive. They're making the road as they go, innovating and leading a light forward for us all to follow. We're here to learn from the first permanent real estate cooperative to qualify for a national direct public offering, or DPO, under A+ through the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, which we can hear more from Noni Session and Annie McShearis about. It's a real pleasure to pass the mic to evprex Executive Director, Noni Session today. Thank you so much for being here, and let's learn together.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Caroline, can you hear me? Yes? Okay. I'm Noni Session, the Executive Director and one of the co-founders, one of the founding members of the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. Before I move on, I'd also like to introduce, I don't know if we can spotlight Annie very quickly, Caroline. But I'd also like to introduce our fundraising director, Annie McShiris, who we are so fortunate to capture as a member of our co-op. We were so excited. And there's Annie. Say hi, Annie. And we'll be talking to you today about our work as evprex. Okay, so as you know, we're East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. In this first slide, you can see that these are the two residential acquisitions that we've made. These are the members of those housing configurations. The upper is our residents at Prince Street in Berkeley, and the lower are our residents at Co-op 789 in North Oakland. So we start there because when we came out of the box as an organization, next slide, Annie, as an organization whose mission was to support Black and Brown and allied communities to remain rooted in Oakland and the East Bay through supporting their ability to collectively organize, finance, purchase, and occupy land and housing. We presumed that what we would be creating in a strict manner is permanent, affordable, community-controlled housing. And as we moved through the process and learned sort of step by step and brick by brick, literally, what it took to finance, and rehab and support the cooperative infrastructure build of a housing configuration, what it took to speak to CDFIs and mission-aligned lenders and funds about the vision we undertook. We started to see that what really was missing across the sectors was sort of, I hesitate to use this word innovative, but there was sort of an absence of innovative thinking around the relationship between transferring assets back into communities and the ultimate outcomes of what economic development, and even at this stage in the pandemic, what economic recovery could or would look like. This is in the sense that I'll describe first sort of our organizational anatomy, in that we see ourselves as pulling strategies and techniques from some of the best from across the sectors, each of which and more have attempted to make inroads into this field of these inflated real estate markets, financial tools really becoming the function of oppressing and displacing communities, and even how to create community control out of our proliferated industry, the nonprofit industrial complex, to use kind of a derisive term. And so we looked across all those fields and at their gains and their losses, and asked ourselves what we needed to pull from their techniques. So we see ourselves as at least pulling at least 5 elements from across the fields. From across the worker owner cooperative field, we structured ourselves as a democratic power sharing collective, right? Meant to uproot a lot of the practices that keep power out of the hands of the people who are most concerned with the change and the transformation. We look to the housing cooperative movement to support our communities in building out their cooperative governance and infrastructure for long-term co-stewardship. We look to the movement building field to create an inclusive, empowering, and activating thinking, learning, and engagement environment around a field typically where everyday people, the laymen, are excluded in favor of the expert, right? The real estate agent, the financier, the executive director, and that has to be collapsed in order to shift where we perceive power to be grounded in this process. We also look to the community land trust, long history of the community land trust, in the ways that we built out our bylaws and our agreements with our resident owners in order to protect the land into perpetuity so that it can't be recirculated into an extractive market or used extractively. We also look at the investment fund or the investment cooperative to look at how collective economic action really can level the playing ground with many of these individual or more competitive market actors, such as real estate brokers, land speculators, futures. I could go on, right? And so what we're doing, when you look around our city around 2017, and you ask our city leaders why our city looked the way it looked, many of them gave sort of a kind of tragic, but what they believe to be very true response, that we don't really have control, as city leaders, we don't really have control over the so-called free market, which I hope most of us know is a fiction. These are individuals making choices each day with each gesture, right? And that at best, we could only run and determine the wealth of our city through government dispensation, through the free will of active market actors, such as profit-seeking developers, or from this grant system, this nonprofit, what I sometimes think of as this nonprofit treadmill, where you're moving from one pot of need determined by a funder to another pot of need determined by a funder. And so really your long-term arc is never fully determined from within your organization or your body of community members or your neighborhood, right? As opposed to being determined or over-determined, at least from above, by those who are holding the capital. Next slide, Annie, thank you. But what we know is that for long-term change and for long-term power, for long-term permanence, which is, I guess, contradiction, there are certain interventions that we felt needed to be an integral part of our technical work. So we presumed that we had to combine a philosophical and political set of ethics that drives how we make our technical interventions as a nod toward those 5 areas where we have wanted to model after these fields, but really displace some of the comfort and the sort of passive acceptance of the processes that really epitomize those fields, and makes them kind of counterproductive despite their missions and their goodwill and their longstanding history, and even despite their technical possibilities. So as we struck out of the box to try to acquire our first project, which is Co-op 789 you saw above, we entered the field while challenging some of the perceived notions of the CDFI, the mission deadline lender, the funder. We also wanted to set new standards. So not just to speak against, but to make heard a unique voice, a unique perspective on what we could do with the field. So this is not that we fight things, it's that we build things, right? We have to create a new foundation for ourselves. And as much as we need the people in our activist sphere who fight and challenge systems, we have to be partners and build new infrastructure for folks to land as they fight down these structures. So, if you are not prepared to win, then these processes like pipelines can re-instantiate themselves after the small victory. We have to prepare ourselves with infrastructure that can hold a new vision and not assume we can slot a new vision into infrastructure that's only been barely shaken at its foundations. So for evprex, functioning in the finance and real estate and community building field, we work with 3 mission pillars. The first is land without landlords. And it really recognizes that this idea of private property has really, unless you are among the lucky few that have been able to attain individualized ownership, or as we're seeing right now, like massive corporate ownership, that your life's possibilities are bent on a cycle of impermanence, a month, a year, a week, a generation. And then once again, you have to pick up your bags, pick up your stories, your histories, your networks, and move them and replant them elsewhere as the owners of land, the landlords, make new decisions about what they do with their land. So our technical and philosophical vision is that we remove land permanently from the speculative market so as to give people the time and space and the generations needed to rebuild a future together, to agree on cultural commitments, to have a place to return to feed new members of the community. Our second mission pillar, restorative economics, which is something that we're all learning deeply around with the support of Namarka Agbo, is the sense that our communities have been dispossessed of more than just the concrete asset of land and housing. Our communities have also been dispossessed of the more intangible elements of wealth, which are relationships and skills and tools and conversations and language, so that this closing of this gap between our ability to sustain ourselves and the expert skill sets that in this hyper technocratic society stand between us and control, right? So if you don't have access to a lawyer, if you don't have access to a real estate broker, if you don't have $30,000 to pay a consultant to write your SEC application, you're just SOL, as we like to say. So evprex has spent a lot of its formative energy learning to do the technical work from a layman's position, so that those skill sets, those tools, that front loading of infrastructure build can be passed on to both the co-ops we help form through our work and community members who want to come dip into our well and take those techniques and use them in their own communities according to their own vision. So for example, we have built this tool, which one might think of as a plug and play pro forma, and we're training our community members on how to vet the financial feasibility of their own projects, including the relationships they need to build, the networks that they need to tap into for the fundraising, and the basic numbers, the rent rolls, the interest rate, the taxes, the debt service, so that that this becomes something that you don't have to passively wait for another to do for you. Our third mission pillar, Heal People Power, is really trying to make a clear statement about the necessary reflexivity we have to maintain in our own professional, bureaucratic, and technical work, to know that we're using tools that we've all been conditioned in such a manner that it reproduces the same oppressions, it reproduces the same hierarchies. So we have to understand, despite having really great, sexy missions, that we have to uproot from inside our own work the entrenched hierarchical Western power practices, so that we don't reproduce them unintentionally, inadvertently, in the things that we create out in the field, in the ways we use language, in the ways we assume control has to happen. So a small example is our Democratic Staff Collective, where we do spend time really questioning and challenging how we use power with our collective. An external example is thinking about organizational formation and how the nonprofit, the technical structure of the nonprofit organization is actually one that, despite great sounding missions and well-intentioned executive directors and boards that are committing their free time to building these organizations, we have to recognize that they are also spaces where power remains cloistered around, among those who have the luxury and the time to assert control. So it's one reason that we incorporated as a California Cooperative Corporation, which is a for-profit corporation, but for the profit of the members and the community for which we undertake these projects and with which we undertake these projects. So in each of our technical interventions, we are thinking at each stage what it means politically and philosophically for maintaining power, control, transparency, and really moving resources to folks instead of cloistering them in one place where they can only be accessed by those who manage to get hired as the executive director, who manage to get elected to the board, right? There's so much more we have to spread around our community, so many more resources, so much more power, so many more options we have to spread around to begin to build sovereignty back for our community. Next slide, Annie. So one of the examples that really came out as we started to understand this sort of poverty of imagination for what economic development really looks like is this project called the Esthers Orbit Room Cultural Revival Project. It came out of this convening that we had called the Black Economic Salon, where we were just trying to have like a very relaxed food and alcohol filled conversation around what a Black economic structure could look like in Oakland, where folks knew that they had essential needs, but really out of it came the clarity that essential needs in many communities are rooted around the nexus of arts and culture, right? You find a cobbler, but you find the cobbler next door to the textile person, right? You may find the grocer, but you often find the grocer near the small artisan or the small artist. And so as we started to understand from the Black Economic Salon, which incidentally, people decided they wanted to form a committee to plan for what viable businesses would look like in West Oakland. you found that it was really dependent on a cultural hub that roots all the other essential services. And next slide, please. And as we looked around in West Oakland for where that could ground itself, we found it couldn't ground itself at the BART station, as there was no site control, that it needed to ground itself somewhere that had a strong resonance in the community's psychogeographical landscape. So either you needed to leverage something that was already there, or you needed to create it, because there had to be sort of an activation of the imagination in order to galvanize people for something that seems nearly impossible in this economy, and definitely something that hasn't been done for 20 or 30 years, which is long before communities had been dismantled, particularly along this corridor by eminent domain, freeway improvements from the Department of Transportation, the BART, the post office, and general municipal neglect. And if you look at the 7th Street corridor, it is dotted with our liquor stores, and that's no understatement. At the other end of the corridor, we are so lucky to have, at this point in our history, Mandela Grocery Cooperative, which was a key fertilizer in my cooperative vision, as my awareness around the work that needed to be done was developing. So they are our development partners at the Mandela Parkway end of the 7th Street corridor, and our acquisition Esthers Orbit Room is at the head of the corridor at Wood Street. Next slide, please. So really, Esthers Orbit Room, which is a 3 to 4 ground floor commercial and sort of healing and consumer art spaces we're bringing to market: a gallery, a cafe, a bar and music venue, a resource room, and healing art space with a garden, an arbor in the back. And 3 residential artist co-housing units on the 2nd floor. It's really an effort to look at the formula for how you combine economic development that is on the ground floor with the cultural framework of the history, the rich history of the Black arts movement, with regrounding community ownership through bringing in commercial co-owners and resident owners who really take back the community. So our work, having raised $5 million for this project, our work is really now to share the decision-making with the surrounding community members, to find, galvanize, and recruit our core advisory group who wants to help us define and design what the ownership relationship will look like inside of Esthers Orbit Room, to search out the artist residents who really want to sort of ground into the space and re-own the corridor, and to launch we have this the community grants project to launch these mini civic improvement projects to really move more resources into people's hands, but also get their hands on the built environment, the corridor, the street, the sidewalk, the pylons, and really remark the West Oakland corridor as a place that's owned and controlled by the visionaries, the regular people, the kids, the old people in the community, and bringing them all together in an interclass, intergenerational space, so as to rebuild as a whole and not through these silos where we are really over occupied by trying to find the next pot of money, rather than being able to take that other 20 hours of the week, as Caroline points out, to create visionary space, to program, to find more people to join in on the vision, to share it with those who didn't have the technical assistance front loaded, or the startup capital front loaded. So to be specific, we've raised about an additional $300,000 just to offer a runway to the cooperative businesses that become the commercial resident owners inside of inside of the Esthers Orbit Room project, right? It's an understanding that you have to use capital to support people's vision building and give them time so that they don't have to compete in this fictitious manner with these large capital holders. And it becomes sort of like a scaled incubation space where Silk incubated us. We will be incubating the Esthers Orbit Room people. And as they teach and share their arts, their culinary skills, their community magic, they will be teaching and sharing those skill sets out to other people. That is how restorative economics really works, right? And so last slide, I'm gonna hand it over to Annie to fill in any gaps I missed and let you know how we ask folks to participate, and looking forward to questions.
Thanks so much, Noni. Can folks hear me okay?
Maybe they could highlight you as well. Yes, there you are.
Okay, great. Yeah, so just to come full circle, and again, my name is Annie McShiras. I'm evprex Investment and Fundraising Director. And as Caroline mentioned at the beginning of this call, we are the first permanent real estate cooperative to qualify for a direct public offering through the SEC. And so what that means is that we're actually able to raise to crowdfund equity dollars from our community. And that fits into the mission pillar of restorative economics, because we're democratizing the process of receiving capital to support the property acquisitions that we then hand back to the community for community ownership and community control. And we're really trying to, part of our work is not only to transform real estate and land for the benefit of our BIPOC community members and our legacy residents of Oakland and the East Bay, but also to interrogate and to challenge and to transform the financial system and the way the financial system intersects with land and real estate and arts and culture. And so, you know, this is part of our work. Part of our work is to really engage with the capital community, with the funder community, you all, and have that conversation. And have the conversation about what does it look like to support each other, and what does it look like to do, not only for us to do non-extractive real estate and development, real estate development, which is what we're doing with these properties, but also how can we finance those properties in a way that's also non-extractive and that also centers the culture and arts creators. And so in that way, we're inviting you all to join us to liberate capital. And to think creatively about the use of your own capital to support an integrated capital stack. And so we bring investment dollars in through our crowdfunding equity, and those are our investor owners that can come in and support the work that we're doing. We also bring in philanthropic grant dollars to do all of the organizing, arts education, community galvanizing work. That allows us to provide that runway to some of the businesses we're trying to incubate at Esthers Orbit Room, as well as low interest or zero interest mission aligned loans and debt. We also accept those types of capital. And we've worked with foundations across all different areas of focus, from economic development to arts and culture to racial justice, to support us with all these different types of capital. And so I invite you to think creatively with us, and I'm going to drop in the chat our prospectus that gives you a little more of a sense of Esthers Orbit Room and some nitty-gritty finances connected with that project, as well as a little more depth and context that Noni started to get into with that particular project that centers the Black arts community in West Oakland. So I'll just pause there and see if there's questions and hand it back over to Caroline, our moderator, to continue the conversation.
Hey, yeah, welcome everyone. We're going to move into questions now. And I believe Eddie has the first question for you both.
Yeah, so I really, first of all, thank you so much for sharing this with us. And I want to speak specifically about those who have supported your work, those who've supported your work effectively, those who've supported your work in a way where you wish others would do likewise. Can you talk a little bit about that, about who has done what, and what did they do that was unique? What did they do that was different?
I can start. I think there's been 3 stages of what I like to think of as incubation, and sort of sovereign partnerships, that I think are important to highlight. I think the first stage, that is, I think, of critical importance is the stage we went through with Sustainable Economies Law Center, right? Who really held evprex very closely into its space in terms of the prior relationships it had built, the networks it had begun to form, the streams of capital that it had been cultivating for quite some time, and the sort of intellectual lineage and relationships that it found itself in. And so, sort of, instead of kind of like a parent organization in the classic kind of patriarchal sense, they became kind of our nurturance buddy. So all of those relationships, instead of holding those relationships and talking about us, we were invited into the conversations with them, right? They also co-wrote a lot of grants that they would both either channel to our development or we would initiate projects together. And all of that capital that they wrote grants for or were supported by foundations, it wasn't them telling us what they were going to do for us. We conversed about it and really made a co-plan so that the founders inside of evprex from the outset began to work with Silk in a position of co-sovereignty, right? Where I've seen other incubation relationships where it's almost continues to reproduce this sort of like charity gift hierarchy, where we're told what we can do and then we come back and ask for more and justify it, rather than really co-planning and co-visioning what we are each creating together inside of our organizations and working a pathway together that supports each other's purposes. And then there has to be a lot of transparency and power sharing around that. I think the next sort of stage after this kind of startup runway stage that I think is pretty notable is the relationship that we built with the Restorative Economies Fund through the Katali Foundation. And that relationship was really critical because it became the sort of first kind of a nod in the field toward foundation's ability to take a risk on our work. And we didn't show up to that relationship in this state of what a lot of foundations call readiness. They're not ready. Instead, we showed up to the relationship having done our infrastructure work, having really clarified our vision and moving our vision forward in partnership with Silk, but also in an independent and sovereign manner. And Katali Foundation, I think with their founder, their CEO, having done that prior work in Open Oakland, was very committed to a peer lending relationship, right? Where you're starting to see this framework deployed called trust-based lending. And what that means then is that we are not showing up as beggars at the door of the Katali Foundation, but rather knowing and clarifying that evprex and Katali Foundation had the same goal of building out regenerative projects that could live a long life and also return this capital investment to their body of investors. And so from the outset, when we began to meet, we put forward the material we had. Katali Foundation would read it, ask back questions, and we would develop our answers and our infrastructure for our ability to hold the different concerns of getting to a place of to do due diligence. So we built together before we even reached the due diligence stage, before we were put in front of Impact Assets, who is the foundation that deploys the actual capital of Katali Foundation. We spent almost a year just building our capacity to, what do you want to say, pass the F's of financial readiness. So we built that together. Some people might call that technical assistance, but it was also a partnership where there wasn't this fear of hiding or failure, but rather knowing that we're headed somewhere together. Another part of that, when we got to the due diligence stage, was Katali's Foundation's willingness to do the social labor of writing the memos that really indicate or vouch for our ability to use and repay this capital. And I'd say a third and more recent stage that we've reached, that we're really interested in how the future goes for this, is we've recently built a strong relationship with the Hewlett Foundation, who is looking for innovative ways to deploy arts capital for economic development. And because we have sort of walked this road, as I mentioned in the beginning, brick by brick, Hewlett Foundation is deploying capital to our organization and organizations like ours, with the expectation that we are transferring our skill sets and our learning back into their organization, so that their lawyers, so that their officers know how to lend, grant, and transfer capital to organizations like ours who don't fit this typical nonprofit structure, and recognize that work as charitable work, in that it is the culture and the technical work that builds cultural sovereignty. So each of these are coming as a mutual learning partnership, and being transparent about the kind of capital they have and what they inside of their organization need to have transferred from us in order for us to build an ecosystem that's strong and past the moment of community sovereignty being a fashion.
Yes, thank you for that. There's so much in there, and I'm noticing the time, and I want to make sure that we hear also from the questions that you all have who have joined us for this hour. So again, we're talking about what can we do with permanently affordable space. We've heard so much. Noni Session, thank you. Annie McShiris, thank you. What questions do you all have? What are your dreams and desires in relationship to this work? We'd love to hear questions either in the chat or out loud. And if not, Eddie and I have lots of questions. Anything coming to mind? Okay, I'm gonna have another quiet moment and then we'll get into, yeah, Joseph, I don't know if your hand is raised for us or for something else. Okay, let's see. Questions. Can you share more detail about the actual financial structure of your work? How are investors and lenders paid back? Do you have a project budget or pro forma you can share?
You want to take this one, Annie?
Sure, that's a great question. We get this a lot because we are we do take land and housing off the speculative market and bring it into the hands of community control. And so our business model reflects that mission. And per each property that we purchase, we try to find prices, and we negotiate with the sellers to purchase at prices that are slightly below market or concessionary, so that our modeling pans out. But the investor owners have a minimum 5-year term, and target return of 1.5%, which at this point in time is not quite keeping up with the rate of inflation, but it's comparable to a rate you may receive in a savings account at a credit union. And so we actually modeled ourselves in this way intentionally. And so over time, our investors are paid back through the monthly contributions of our resident owners. So those are the tenants that live and work in the affordable real estate that we create. They also have control over that real estate and are co-owners with our community of 300 community members, community owners. And so that's the short answer. The long answer, I'm happy to follow up and send pro formas and show our financial modeling that builds us out. But in essence, because we're able to find non-extractive financing to finance the properties themselves, we are receiving lower rates on the financing that we receive. We're able to then move that back, recycle that back into the hands of our community investors through the monthly contributions of our tenants. And we're also in part subsidized by philanthropy and grants for the operations of our organization. So that's a very short answer, and happy to elaborate in further detail offline to give more of an understanding of the full financial picture. If folks are curious afterwards, happy to share my email, and you can email me directly to ask that question, and I can share pro formas if you'd like to dig into more detail around that.
And there's a question about ownership as opposed to renting. Is there space for renting? I think, yeah, they want to understand more about renting versus owning in the real estate cooperative.
So again, it's sort of a hybrid model in that the ownership is transferred to our entire cooperative. So our cooperative, evprex, a multi-stakeholder cooperative, owns title to the properties, and the resident owners, that's one of our owner groups of 4, join us in those properties and pay monthly contributions. They are also owners in the sense that they are the resident owner category of our multi-stakeholder cooperative. But the difference between individual ownership and our model is that our model is all about community ownership. So they co-own these properties with our community of 300 member owners of evprex. And what that means is that they're able to come in and find and pay their monthly contributions at a permanently affordable rate. And they're also able to build limited equity for themselves. So you might understand it conceptually as a limited equity resident owner model. And again, that's all something that I can elaborate further in terms of our financial model. But in essence, they're joining us as resident owners, and what that means is that they pay monthly contributions, which you might consider rent, but is actually contributing to the surplus of the cooperative that they can receive dividend payments back in the form of patronage, as many cooperatives are structured in that way. And so that's the unique hybrid model of our approach. It's not individual wealth and individual ownership. When resident owners join evprex, they join as one of 300 member owners of the entire cooperative and receive financial benefit for that membership, but not in the traditional way that we might think of individual ownership, if that makes sense.
Someone said, as you add more communities, will each community have control/ownership of their own space, or is it at the trust level and co-ownership for all spaces? I think if you could be clear about who is renting and who is directly using the space, and then who is an investor member, that might, in terms of numbers, help spell that out.
And Anne, if you want to unmute yourself and ask directly, please feel free.
Sure, and I could even elaborate on my question is, we're from Colorado and we have a community trust that's being proposed here. And the conversation is really around as they acquire as the trust acquires different spaces. With the model here is a little different, but would the trust be at that sort of ownership level over all of them, and decision making be done for all the communities, or does each individual community have a voice in their own space.
Yes. Can I take that one, Annie?
Please go ahead.
Yes. Okay, sweet. Yes, each individual collective has a voice in their own space. There are some larger decisions that the whole ownership body votes on, and those are determined on a case-by-case basis. But within each acquisition, the folks who are the resident owner members co-govern and co-steward those properties in partnership with the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. So when we initiate the relationship, we create legal share documents that define things like minimum maintenance agreements, who does what work when, what we would return at the end of the year if there were surpluses. When there's conflict, what do we do? If a resident owner leaves, how will y'all choose your next resident owner? So they stay in direct governance relationship with the evprex staff collective, but they are not determined by the wider body what they do on their individual property and acquisition scale.
Thank you. That's helpful because they may have different competing, different interests. You need
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I'll say we even put together the capital stacks differently for every project, because it really, this is one of the, I think one of the things of the recipe that we're landing on is that we can't assume that a cookie cutter generic capital stack works for each group of people. There's going to be different exigencies. So even how and at what rate they have to pay back the cost of their project is going to be different for every group, because the needs are just going to look very different depending.
So I'm afraid I need to wrap us up. Fantastic. You're sharing your information. That is great. I have shared out a Google Doc for folks to sign up to receive more information and to receive updates. Again, this is really hugely important that you've taken this time with us, and we are so grateful. Noni, Annie, thank you so much. I want to ask everybody, one, to give Noni and Annie a big round of applause. Two, to make sure that you look to them for examples that can be applied in your own communities. By all means, support evprex. And for those of you who are in other parts of the nation, support comparable examples in your communities. And I also want to say, Caroline, a great big thank you. And I think Nati is
Nati is here. What? Yeah.
Natalia, thank you so much. I do want to say it is absolutely, Art.Coop has been absolutely essential to this work. This work wouldn't be happening without you, so please make sure that you support Art.Coop as well. Thank you so much for joining us for this. Please don't ever hesitate to reach out to us, to Caroline, to Annie, to Noni for more information, and we're looking forward to your joining us for these upcoming discussions now through April. Thank you. Oh, and happy holidays.